Howdy! You're listening to the Breakaway Podcast, a Bible study recorded on the campus of Texas A&M. Thanks for listening and enjoy the talk.
Tonight's scripture begins in Exodus 15, verse 22. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Then the Lord made for them a statute and a rule, and there he tested them, saying, "If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord your healer." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water.
In Exodus chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Zin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather the day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily." So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?" And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him. What are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord." Verse 13. In the evening quail came up and covered the camp, and in the morning dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground.
Exodus 17, starting in verse 1. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Zin by stages, according to the commandments of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?"
Well, not long after I graduated college, some buddies of mine and I decided that we were going to hike the Grand Canyon. And we did the deal where you camp at the rim, hike down into it, stayed for a couple nights, and then hike back out, which was pretty incredible. Because the first day, it takes several hours to descend into the earth. It's really surreal. And then when we got down there, we spent the night at the bottom, and the next day we were going to spend all day at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. And after that full day of hiking the day before, my buddies really didn't want to hike anymore. They just wanted to kind of sit by the stream and do nothing. But I had read about this waterfall 6 miles down through the canyon, and I kind of wanted to see it. So we had a great time hiking down together, all of us laughing, enjoying each other, having a great time in the Grand Canyon. Amazing, it's so fun. But when we got to that moment and I wanted to hike on, they were like, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to go. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to go for a walk. I'm feeling good. And we'll just see how it goes. So I just started going for a walk, that general direction, and it was a beautiful day, and I'm talking to the Lord and having fun, and as I'm moving along, I decided, you know what? I'm feeling good. I'm just going to keep going. Let's hit the waterfall. Let's just do this. And so I just keep walking and head that direction, and I'm going on, and it's been a while that I'm just talking to God. Thanks for nature. This is amazing, and on we go. And then it strikes me, wait a second, how long have I been walking? And I realize I have no sense of time. I have no idea how long I've been out there. And I'm like, have I gone for miles? What if I pass it? I don't even know if I have. I don't know where I am. I didn't even bring a watch. You can't see the sun because of the canyon. I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. And then I realized, man, I didn't really bring hardly any water. I brought like a bottle of water, and that's it. And I'm like, is that sufficient for 12 miles of hiking? Like, is this the dumbest thing ever? Like, I've got this and a granola bar, and that's it? And then I realized, so should I turn around? Or am I already so far that I've already reached it? I don't know. And so I decide, you know what I need to do? I just need to walk faster, all right? And so I just start to go. And so instead of having a stroll with God, I'm sort of power walking through the Grand Canyon. And I come up on this couple, and super sweet couple. I'm talking to them, great guy with his, I guess, girlfriend, really nice girl, young with white hair, which was really kind of wild looking, but cool. And so I'm visiting with them, and I'm like, yeah, I'm walking to this waterfall. And they're like, oh, so are we. Do you want to go together? And I'm like, well, I'm kind of in a hurry, so I'm going to just jet on. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, I've heard it's up there a ways. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, I'll see y'all later. And so I'm just blasting off going. And so I'm going along for a while. And again, no concept of time. I'm like, it could have been 5 miles. It could be 10 miles by now. They said there would be a sign. I didn't see a sign. Like, I don't know where a sign is. Maybe I passed the sign and missed it. And so I'm looking for a waterfall, and the sun's going to go down, and I'm going to be just out in the middle of the woods, and the animals are going to come out. And so I start to get this moment where literally I'm starting to panic. And so I'm out there, and finally at one moment I just stop, and I'm like, okay, assess the situation. You don't know where you are. You don't know what time it is. You don't have enough water. This is going to be so bad. And so I hit this moment where I just kind of let all the fear in, and I'm like, this is so bad. Higher ground. I've got to find higher ground to give me perspective. And so literally, I look at the canyon, and I just start scrambling, all right? And I'm going up the canyon, ripping through all these bushes, and I get up a certain height, and I get to this moment where I don't know how he didn't hear me. Maybe I was upwind from him, but I startle a deer, and he was about this far away. And I startle him, and my startling of him startles me. So literally, all in 1 second, he's like, ah, and I'm like, no! And so I fall backwards, and there was a thorn bush, and I drive this huge thorn into my hand so far that it gets into the meat and makes my hand seize. And so I'm like, all right, and then like blood's pouring down, and I'm up there, and I'm like, I don't see a waterfall, I'm bleeding, and I'm like, oh God. So finally I was like, I just got to get back, run away, and so like I run back down, eventually hit the path, and as I get to the path, I hear a roar of a waterfall just down this little lane. And so I walk down this lane, maybe 10 yards, and there's that young couple sitting at this beautiful pool of water under a waterfall with their feet in the water, just sort of dangling. And I come stumbling up, cut up, dirty, bleeding. And I'll never forget, they look up at me like, what happened to you? And I couldn't even fake it. I was like, well, there's this, I don't know. I got scared. I don't know. It's just like, oh, man. It's like, there's no cool points on this moment, right? And so they sit me down, and I tell them the whole story. I don't know what I'm doing, basically. And so they give me some water. They give me some food. They bandage my wounds. And we enjoy this waterfall for a moment. And then I walk back. And as I'm walking back, I'm laughing about, oh, this is great. I'm not far. It's going to be fine. And then I just thought back on, if that was like a wilderness survival test, I guess you could say I passed because I survived, but I get 0 points for style. You know what I mean? And I learned something about myself. One of my first hiking experiences, like you get me out there, and all I need is about this much ambiguity, just a little lack of direction, no visible sign of provision, and what rises out of me is sheer panic, right? Where some humility and trust of this couple might have led to a much more enjoyable experience the whole way. Now, why mention that to you? For this reason. We've been walking through the book of Exodus, and we're in this new part where God has set these people free, and they have watched him set them free in an amazing way. We're looking at them right on the back end of coming out of the Red Sea. Literally, they're like, we're going to die. God separates the Red Sea. They get out, they hit the other side, and they go, We didn't die! And they have this huge worship session. Takes almost a whole chapter where they just freak out, lose their minds about how honest, amazing God is. Tambourines get out, dancing ensues, they go crazy, all right? Singing about the glories of God, how amazing He is, how awesome it is. He's my strength, He's my salvation, He's my song. He will lead me to His holy mountain. He loves me. And then our text begins, and then He leads them into the wilderness. And God takes His people and He leads them out into the wild, right? And what's interesting is, as they hit the wild, you get to see now what happens to the people of God as they hit a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of adversity, a little bit of lack of evident provision. What happens to them? And we're going to see how they respond to the test. Really, where they are is they're where I imagine a lot of you are. That for many of you, college is this moment. That, man, you were walking with God maybe in high school, and for some of you, there's always been kind of rails around you. You know, you had great parents that loved the Lord, and it's like, do you really think that's a good idea, son? All right? And you had a great youth pastor that was like, here's how to walk with God, and kind of laid it out for you. And you sort of had these rails, and so you're like, I trust God. I have great faith. I know what I'm doing. I'm awesome. I'm running with Him. And now suddenly you get to college, and all the rails are gone, and a little bit of lack of direction, a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of lack of provision. And some of you, oh, God, you start to panic, right? Or others of you, maybe you didn't grow up with any of that stuff. But you're here in college and you're looking around and going, there's no rails on my life. I am out here in the wild, and is God up there, and does He care, and where is this going, and what am I going to do? And you're wondering, how do I navigate life well? And so we're looking at them as God puts them in the wilderness. And He's going to tell them, hey, I'm leading you out into the wilderness in the desert. And He says it later in Deuteronomy. I'm doing it out here to test you. This is a big test, to see what comes out of you when I put a little adversity in front of you. And He tells them, I'm doing it for your good, that it may go well with you. Adversity is a good thing. It was interesting for me, a couple of years ago, I met with one of the guys who supports us in ministry. He owns a massive Angus farm, not far from here. And I remember going out there and looking at this beautiful landscape. Literally, it's like, if there's a cow heaven, it's here, you know? Just lush green grass, and they all have like their own stalls, you know, and personalized caretakers. It's really over the top. Gorgeous. And I'm out there and I'm like, this is amazing. And he's walking me through how all they just sort of breed these incredibly massive Angus cow animal. I mean, just amazing thing. And I remember he told me, he was like, yeah, we raise them out here. And I was like, they must love it out here. And he's like, oh yeah, they do. And he said, so they're born out here. And then when they hit, I don't know what, like teenage years and cow years, I don't know what that is. He's like, when they get a little older, we ship them off to like Beeville, Texas, Southwest Texas. And my family's from there. I know that. I'm like, that's nothing but like scrub brush. There's nothing out there. I'm like, like, why would you do that? Like, do you hate them? Like, you're like anti-cow? Like, why would you do that to them? And he said, well, here's the thing, Ben. He was like, we found that if we just raise them here, what happens when we sell them is if all they've had is comfort, their hooves are too weak, and they'll crack and break, right? And so what happens is when they're young, we send them out into the wild of West Texas, right? To make them stronger, right? God loves that kind of stuff. And so what you're going to see, and we read 3 texts because they put them together on purpose. You can't tell every day of the story of the people of God in the Old Testament. The Old Testament's selective, but it selects 3 moments that all kind of sound alike to give you 3 little tests. God leads them into the wilderness, and God's going to put problems in their life, and we're going to see their reaction, and then we're going to see God respond to them with provision, right? And as we see those, we're going to learn 3 principles. When you get out into the wilderness of life, I don't know where I'm going. I don't know how to be provided for relationally, monetarily, socially, emotionally. Oh God, where am I? When you hit those moments, we're going to get 3 principles for how to navigate the wilderness well as we look at these 3 stories real quickly. Got it? All right, so we got to jump in. Story number 1, you hit the first problem God gives them in chapter 15, in verse 22. It says, they went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. They were praising God. Now 3 days later, no water. And as we learned earlier, that can be stressful, okay? And so as one day fades into the next, their anxiety begins to grow. And then in verse 23, it says, when they came to Marah, they found water, but they couldn't drink it because it was bitter. Therefore, it's named Marah, which means bitter. So they're going 3 days. They don't have any water. Their water's running out. They're starting to panic a little bit. Finally, they get water, and they drink it, and it's bitter. And it's got to be pretty bad water for you to go 3 days in the desert and not being willing to drink that. It's a pretty big trial, all right? And so they get to this moment. This is a legitimate trial. This isn't a Red Sea on one side, Pharaoh on the other side, we're all going to die trial. But this is a mundane, everyday of life trial, right? It is. And God puts it right in their way. Will God put tests in your path? Will he put you in situations where you feel like he's not giving you what you need? And then will he add to something that you feel like you don't want? Yeah, he'll do that. God, I need water. And then bitter water shows up. God, I need direction on my major. Help me. And then he gives you a prof that's unreasonable and mean. It's the opposite of what I wanted, right? God, give me friends. And then he gives you a complicated roommate. Will God do that? Oh, yeah, he will. He does. And the people react. So much of life is not what happens, but how you respond to what happens. And these people are given a legitimate trial. And verse 24 says, and the people grumbled against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? So they hit a crisis. And here they just saw God lead them through the Red Sea. Unbelievable miracle, right? And yet 3 days later, they get to a point where there's no water. And how do they respond? Do they sing the same song? The Lord is my strength and my salvation and my song. He will lead me to his holy mountain. No. They say, there's no water out here. What's the deal? There's no water, right? And if you don't miss the language, it's not like they came to Moses like, excuse me, Moses, we're noticing a lack of water out here. It says they grumbled against him, right? They quit looking up. They just looked down at their circumstances. And what rises out of them is complaining. They lose their song, right? That's what happens. And before we make fun of them a whole lot, we just need to realize we do the same thing. So before we get too hard on them, let's just realize we do the same thing. And if you don't believe me, try this. Go back through your Twitter feed, all right? And see if after a great breakaway on Tuesday where you were just singing, Spirit lead me, and you're just going for it. See if you happen to complain 3 days later. Just see if anywhere on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, you're like, oh, I hate this club, I'm so tired of, I got to wait for it, right? Just see it. Some of you, after the first couple breakaways, didn't even wait till you got out of the parking lot before you started complaining. And I read it, right? So we do this too. There's a propensity in us to be cry-cries. There is. And if you don't believe me, it's interesting. Pew Research just did a study on Twitter, and they were trying to find trends on Twitter. And they said, really, it's difficult to identify a trend. Does it skew young? Kind of, but you can't totally say that. Does it skew liberal? No, sometimes it's liberal, sometimes it's conservative, sometimes it's Republican, sometimes it's Democrat. So they were like, what's the common denominator? And they said, it's hard to pin down common trends. There's only one common trend that comes out loud and clear, and that is that people on Twitter complain a lot. Isn't that interesting? That you're given this completely democratic, say whatever you want, all right? And what do we fill this new device with? Crying about it. About whatever. We're a bunch of cry-cries, right? And that's a normal human response. The New York Times did an article the other day that said when people get a product they don't like, 95% of them won't go talk to the maker, won't send a device, will you make this product better? But they will go and complain about it to 10 friends. So that's a normal response. We do that, which is funny because none of those 10 people have any possibility of making your situation better. So complaining is one of the most worthless activities you can engage in, right? Complete waste of your energy. But what makes this so tragic is that for the world, it's normal to complain about circumstances we don't like. For the people of God who've been rescued from slavery and death and given new life as the covenant people of God, for us to complain shows contempt for our Maker. It's much more serious than, oh, you shouldn't do that. To complain about our circumstances shows contempt for our Maker. And some of you hear that and you go, Ben, no. I'm not complaining about God. I'm complaining about that professor that I don't understand and is an idiot, right? That's what I'm complaining about. Or, Ben, I'm not complaining about God. I'm just complaining about the fact that I don't know what I'm doing here, all right? And none of these people are giving me my emotional needs being met, so I just hate all these people. Or, God, I'm not complaining about God, Ben. I'm just complaining about the fact that I can't find a good man in this place or a good woman around here or whatever. And we just say it's not about God. But let me tell you something. You know how crazy that sounds to me? It's interesting. Moses tells them later in the next episode that they're complaining, and Moses goes, whoa, 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 whoa. Why are you complaining to me? He says, your complaint isn't about me. You're complaining about God. You take it up with him. He says, to complain about your circumstances is to criticize the maker. It is. It would be like if I came to your house and you cooked me a meal, and I went, that smells disgusting. I mean, that is horrendous. Oh, well, I didn't mean that to offend you, though. Why are you offended, right? You'd be like, 'cause I made it? If you criticize the food, you're criticizing the cook. If you criticize a book, you're criticizing the author, right? If you criticize your circumstances, you're criticizing their maker. And so what's problem here is this. They're looking at their circumstances and they're just grumbling against God. I don't like this, I don't like that. And they're not talking to God about it. They're grumbling against God. They're not talking to God about their circumstances. There's no humility to it. There's just whining about it. And you go, well, Ben, that's just life. But let me tell you something. To just whine about your circumstances and not acknowledge God in the midst of them, for the believer of God to not acknowledge God in their circumstances, is to make a declaration to the world that my God is irrelevant. That's what it is. For you to step into your classes or to step into your relationships or to step into your dorm and complain about the situations there and not bring God into that. God, what's your purpose in this? God, are you trying to teach me something here? God, help me navigate this. For you not to engage God honestly in that moment, for the people of God to not acknowledge God in their circumstances, you send a declaration to the world that my God is irrelevant when it comes to real life. Because here's the thing. If we aren't looking to him, they won't see him when they look at us. And that's a problem. If the world doesn't see us looking to God, then they won't see him when they look at us. They won't. And that's the tragedy here. People made for the glory of God miss out on glorifying God. Now, how does God respond? Does he scream at him? Does he yell at him? Does he beat him? No. He tells Moses, throw wood in that water, and the wood makes the bitter water sweet. And then he tells him a story. You listen to me, you obey me. He says, and all that disease that happened in Egypt, I won't bring on to you. So if I'm in the midst of difficult circumstances and I don't like what's going on, how do I respond? God gives them perspective. He gives them the right perspective. And how does he do it? It's interesting. What he does is he starts pointing backwards to previous faithfulness. Because taking some wood and dropping it into water to solve their problems, that's what he just did at the Red Sea. We're all going to die. Moses took a staff, sea parted, we all went through. They get to this water, we're all going to die. Moses drops some wood in, they drink it, they're like, oh. The same God who was faithful back then is faithful now. And it's interesting, they repeat that word bitter. That was the word that was used to describe their slavery. God took the bitter and made it sweet. God will take the bitter and make it sweet. Trust him. Trust him. And the same God who controlled nature in Egypt and could take their river and turn it brackish is the same God that controls the rivers now and can take the bitter and make it sweet. How do I navigate the wilderness well? The first thing you do is you gain the right perspective by looking at past faithfulness. I look and I say, if God's been faithful back then, he'll be faithful now. I believe that. And here's the thing, we have to fight for that. It's a battle. We don't naturally do that. We tend to naturally resist God. You know what we're like? We're like my dog. When we first got our dog, she had been abandoned, right? And she was at this camp, and they're like, we really can't keep her. We don't have the resources to take on another dog. Will you take her? I'm like, sure. So we get this dog, and she had been abandoned, and we guessed abused. Because when we got the dog, I reached out to pet her, and as soon as I put my hand out, she just cowered and hit the ground and then peed all over herself, right? And I'm like, I'm not going to hit you. Like, I don't hit dogs, right? And yet for the next several weeks, months, every time I'd reach out, and she'd just lose her mind. And I'm like, you've had some pain in the past, and so you're projecting onto me some pretty horrible motives. How do I change that? Well, every day I feed you, I give you water, and I pet you, and I'm kind to you. And as I do that over time, you'll start to realize, hey, this guy, I can trust this guy. This guy's cool, right? And now, we're good. And she loves to run up and jump on me. She feels safe with me, right? How did she get there? Well, because over time, she looked back and said, I don't care about all the abuse I've suffered. When he comes, he's been good. He's been faithful. I trust him. And for us, for many of us, maybe you had a bad dad. Maybe you had some bad things in life, whatever. And so when you go to start trusting God, the minute something goes wrong, you're like, God's not real. God's not alive. God hates me. And you just suddenly like wince like he's your enemy. And what you need to do as you walk with God is begin to go, no, wait a second. He was faithful to forgive me of my sin, even when I was his enemy. If he forgave me when I was his enemy, will he be impatient with me when I'm his kid? He's not like that. And so I look back at his past faithfulness, and I trust him. And for some of you, if you don't have a good catalog of God's past faithfulness in your life, for me, I have more now than I did in college. For me, when I get to a difficult moment in life and go, God, I don't know where to go, I look back at me deciding to come to Breakaway and go, that was crazy. But you led me here. You're going to lead me. When I look at some difficulties in front of me, some crossroads, and go, I don't know what to choose, I look back at my choice of where to go to college. And I go, God, you were faithful then. I trust you with this decision now. For me in college, I didn't have a lot of those stories. So you know what I did? I read the Bible and Christian biography. Because as I saw God was faithful with others' lives, I grew confident he'd be faithful with mine. Right? And so what do you do when life's hard? Stop for a minute and get perspective. Is God real? Is God guiding the universe? Then maybe he has purpose for me in this classroom. Maybe he has purpose for me in this dorm room. Maybe he has purpose for me in this organization. And let me not lose focus and panic before I talk to him and think about what it is he might be doing in the circumstance in my life. Problem number 2 they run into is a food shortage, right? And that's a serious problem. And yet it's interesting, and we don't have time to go into all this, when they get to the food shortage, total loss of perspective. They completely freak out, right? They're like, God's trying to kill us, right? And you're like, wow, no. And then they say, it was better in Egypt, right? Which they sound like addicts, you know? Where literally I saw it when I went through rehab with my back. When I injured my back, I remember I had to go through physical rehab in this rehab place. And there were all these people that were there for injuries. And what I found out pretty quickly for most of them is they were preventable injuries. Terrible life decisions had led to some kind of breakdown. Ripped their knees up, hurt their back, whatever, right? And so it's interesting because you go, bad eating, bad exercise, bad lifting decisions have wrecked your life. And so you go through surgery and we show up at this rehab place and these people are trying to help us. And for me, I got to a place where I realized, hey, I have to make some big life changes. If you guys are going to help me. And I'm doing everything they say to do, run on this treadmill, lift up this leg, go up and down like this, whatever you say, because I want to walk and hold my babies, right? So I'm going to do whatever you say. And I'm listening to them. But I remember there was a couple people in there that would always complain and they would always blame the trainer. And it was interesting, I watched one of them work with a guy that runs the place. And every time he'd say to do something, she's like, I don't want to do that. You're trying to hurt me. You're trying to hurt my knee. Why do you keep doing this to me? And I'm sitting there and I'm like, lady, your life decisions are what broke your knee. This dude's trying to help you. Don't blame him. If there's any blame in here, it's on you, right? What he's trying to do is save you. He's saving you. And it's interesting. They look back in Egypt and go, it was so much better in Egypt. And you go, Egypt was killing you. You were a slave. And sometimes I meet Christians that are like, God, it'd be nice if I could just party and get drunk and sleep with whoever. And I'm like, really? That is so crazy. It'd be nice to not know God who rules all things and has purpose and will love me with an everlasting love. All right, just think about that for a little bit. Just sit with that, if that makes any sense. So they cry about it. And here's the interesting thing. God comes to them and God says, hey, you guys crying about it? I'm going to give you. He doesn't get mad at him. He doesn't beat him. He doesn't yell at him. He's a patient dad. They go, God, where are you? Is he going to provide for us? And he's like, yeah, you know what? I'm going to give you quail. little birds that just land in your camp and just sit there till you grab them and eat them. They're going to be like, and just let you take them. And then I'm going to make it rain bread. And not just bread, but they said it was like wafers that tasted like honey. So it's not just like he rained some like crusty like wheat bread kind of, I mean, it was more like a pastry. Raining pastries. But he gives them provision with instruction. He says, I'm going to provide for you, but here's the thing. He says, I want you to only gather as much as you need, share the rest with others. I want you to gather for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, I want you to rest. He gives them provision with instruction. That's what God does, right? And you go, why does God do that? Why doesn't he just give me food? Some of you come to me and you're like, Ben, I've got this problem with this relationship. What do I do? And I'll start asking you about your walk with God. And are you in a community and confessing sin? And you're like, well, I don't want all that. I just want God to fix this problem. And I'm like, that would be like me just feeding my daughter and not instructing my daughter. If I did not try to train my little girls, just sort of fed them and then let them do whatever they want to in life, I will have failed them as a parent, and I would have failed you as a society by subjecting you to a girl like that, right? Because she'd be shallow and intolerable, right? It's a mercy for me to instruct and to train them so that it will go well with them, that I teach them to say please and thank you and things like that, right? The instruction is for their good, right? And so God gives them provision, but with instruction. And some people rail against God's instructions, but you look at what they are. Look at the rules God gives them. He says, I want you to obey these rules. What are the rules? Share and take a day off. That's hardly a dictatorship. Oh, right? But here's the interesting thing. He tells them to do that, and by the end of the text, and we don't have time to read it all, they break every single rule. He says, hey, don't collect on this day, take the day off. So they go out there and try to collect. He says, hey, don't store it up every day. I want you to learn to walk by faith. So they store it up every day. And it's like, seriously? Really? And the reality is, what do I do when life is hard? What do I do when I don't know the right direction God's taking me? First, you get perspective on who God is. Has he been faithful in the past? He'll be faithful now, so I'm not going to panic. And 2, I get my practice from the Word of God. And if I do what he says, he's going to take care of me, and I trust him. He says, collect food for a day. I'm going to collect it, and it'll be all right. He says, share with the community. I'm going to share and trust that God will provide for me. He says, take time and rest. I'm going to do that and believe that he'll give me enough time to complete that all I want, right? And so it's interesting. I remember when I was in college, I got to travel with a guy who teaches like this. And we did this camp together, and he would preach a sermon, and at the end, he would sit at the end of the stage and just let anyone walk up and ask him questions afterwards, which is, I love to do that now. I learned that from him. And I remember when I was in college, I sat by him on the stage when we would go to these camps, and all these young people would come up and ask him these questions. And I would try to think, okay, what if they were asking me, what would I say? And so one after another, they would come up and say, hey, I'm having this problem with my girlfriend. What do I do? I'm having this problem with my boyfriend. I'm having this problem with his parents. And it was interesting. I would sit there, and they're asking him, but I would try to think in my mind like they were asking me. And literally, they would be like, I have this problem with my parents. What do I do? And I'd go, I have no idea. Or they would say, how do I navigate this aspect of this relationship? Nothing. Literally in my mind, I'm like, access file, file empty. And I'm like, so at the end of that time, I looked at him, and I was like, and then he would give an answer that was like brilliant, right? And so I'd ask him, how do you keep doing that? Like any question they ask, whatever it is, you're just like, here's awesome, all right? And I'm just like, how do you keep doing that? And he said, Ben, you want to know the difference between me and them? And I said, yeah, I really do. And he said, here's the difference. I have a quiet time, and they don't. And when he said that, I was like, no, that's not it. That's dumb, because But the more I thought about it when he said that, what he was saying was not just I read my Bible. You can read your Bible and not learn a thing. What he was saying is I'm somebody that sits with the words of God, and then I do what they say. I live them. And as I do that, I find God leads me. And he does that. Where am I supposed to get a job, God? I'm not going to tell you. But I'll tell you the kind of person to be, the kind who works hard as if for the Lord and not for men, the kind that is humble, that respects leadership, that is caring towards others, that's not greedy, I'll tell you the kind of person to be. And let me promise you something. As you be that kind of person, people will want to hire you. God, who am I supposed to marry? I'm not going to tell you. But I'll tell you how to be a marryable person. You be quick to forgive and don't hold grudges, because no one wants to marry someone that's going to hold everything against them, right? You be gentle, right? Because what's attractive about a man is his kindness, right? You be not quarrelsome. Better to live on the corner of a roof than with a quarrelsome wife, right? Don't pick fights. Right? And so he tells you the kind of person to be. And you go, just tell me who I'm supposed to marry. He's like, no, I want you to be this kind of person. And guess what? Now you're just going to have a hard time trying to pick which one of them you marry. I promise you, right? And so what do you do when God's not revealing to you the direct thing of how to handle the wilderness? You excel at the revealed things. I'm going to be great at what he says in his word. Right? And as I do these, I believe he's going to take care of me. Right? And so I get perspective. God is good. He's here in this moment. I trust him. And I'm going to read his word and follow it. Right? Because in his instructions, I'll find life. And the last thing, well, let me say this about that too, is disobedience of God's word betrays arrogance. And I meet some people that they want to worship God, and then they want to come and they just want answers from God. God will forgive you and bring you into his family without any work. And yet once he's brought you in, he wants you to obey him. And some of you, you're like, God, I want you to answer this, this, and this. But when he starts to convict you of sin, you go, no, I'm not going to change that. I'm not going to pray for you to change that. I don't want you to change that. I want to enjoy that sin in my life. I know you don't like that, God, and I don't care. But hey, God, why don't you deal with this issue? And let me tell you something. Disobedience like that is arrogance. It's telling God, I know how to run things better than you. And that's wrong. Last thing, how do I navigate the wilderness? The last trial they get is water from a rock. It's interesting, they get to a place where there's no water again, and now it says they quarrel against Moses. Now they get to a place where they're ready to fight with Moses, and Moses tells God, I think they want to stone me. And that's not him being hypothetical, like, I think they want to emotionally stone me. He means like they want to take rocks and beat me to death. And God says, well, here's the deal. Take them over to a rock, hit it with your staff, and it'll start pouring out water. Right? Now that's not something that obeying God's provision for manna and quail was going to give them. That was just a flat miracle, right? It's not like, well, if I do everything God says, water will flow out of rocks. That was pretty crazy, right? But there was a lesson in that. Here's the thing. You can obey everything in God's word and become a little legalist and still not have any peace and satisfaction in your heart and life. But what happens is God says, man, I want you to trust me with perspective. I want you to walk in obedience to my word. And then he gives them this rock and says that here's at the end of the day, I needed you to realize that your provision is an intimacy with me. That ultimately I want you to obey me, but as you obey me, I'll provide for you. And there will be times where you'll see no provision possible and say, God, there's no answer. And I will bring water out of a rock. I'll do something incredible. And so we're meant to walk with a humble dependence upon God. Right? That I get perspective that he's a good dad. I practice what he says in his word. And then I look to him to provide for me, to care for me. Right? Here's the fascinating thing. As you look into the New Testament, they talk about this moment with God. And Jesus is talking at one moment in John. And Jesus says, you know what? The bread from heaven is not the bread Moses gave you. He says, the true bread from heaven is he who comes and gives you life. And they said, what does that mean? And Jesus said to them, I'm the bread of life. The very next chapter he says, is anyone thirsty? Come to me and let him drink. And out of you will become rivers of flowing water. So it's interesting, when the Apostle Paul read this chapter in 1 Corinthians 10, which he wrote, he speaks of this moment with Moses, and he says they went to the rock, and they struck the rock, and water poured out. And then he said this, and that rock was Christ. It was Christ. See, what's interesting, in the New Testament, it tells us that as they wrote these things, it was for our instruction. It was to teach us. And what we learn is we have a God who rules all things, and he's good. He navigates circumstances in ways we don't fully understand, but he's a better God than we would be, and we can trust him. He's given us his word, that as we obey him, he will teach us how to navigate life well. And yet at the end of the day, the provision of life, life-sustaining water, has to come from him. And for us, the reality is your provision for life, your daily needs emotionally, spiritually, they're going to come from the true rock, Jesus Christ. That's who he is. That he is the one who was nailed to that piece of wood. And as he took all the bitterness in our life, he makes our life sweet. He's the one that when we were starving and in need, he was the true bread that when we eat, we get life. He was the rock that was struck on our behalf, that he took our beating for us, the punishment for our sin, so that pouring out of him is life for all who trust him. And as we become a people who come to Christ for provision, Jesus, forgive me. Jesus, heal me. Jesus, give me wisdom. As we come to him daily in dependence, he provides for us and leads us. So years later, I went hiking with my sister one time in Olympic National Park in Seattle. And we did a multi-day hike along the beach. And you would camp along the beach, and you'd go on for days. And so we had to map out where there would be provision of water. And so I remember as we were hiking along the coast, we got to this point where there was a river that fed out into the ocean. And I thought, okay, that's where we'll stop and re-up our water supply. So we got there one night as the sun was going down. And as we showed up, I went out there to scoop up water from the river, and it was filled with salt. We had hit it at when the tide was coming in. When the tide came in, it shot salt water up into the river, potentially for miles. And it was deep in the night, and as we went out there, the trees were in deep forest. I couldn't even get into the river. It was getting cold, and I realized what I thought would provide for me water isn't providing for me. And so I went back to the beach, and I said, hey, the only water we have is the water we have left in our little jars, which wasn't a whole lot. We had a couple people in our group that I could see the panic starting to hit them. Right? But for me, I remember stopping, and I went, you know what? We're going to believe that God loves us. We're going to pray. And then I pulled out the map and just began to study it. And as I looked at the map, little later down the beach, I saw this little stream that connected down, and I said, we can make it to that by tomorrow morning, and I believe we can get some water there. Right? And so I studied this map, studied where that was, and I remember walking up to the beach that next day, and I'm holding this map saying, I'm just going to do what this little guy says. And as I got to where that river was supposed to be, I looked up, and all I saw was sand. And I'm like, that's not good, right? But I studied this, and I was like, okay, I don't see any water, but it says it's supposed to be right here. And then I looked and said, you know what? It flows to the beach, so let's go that way and just see what we run into. And so we went, and it was interesting. There was some logs stacked up at the end of the beach, so we climbed over these trees, basically. And when we climbed down to the other side, it was basically an oasis. And what had happened was there had been some kind of natural disaster that had dammed up the end of this river, but it was still flowing down into this pool. And so there was this fresh water just out of sight, but it was there. And so we got there, filled up all our water. There was 2 people there. We didn't see anybody on this trip, but we ran into 2 people, Aggies. We're on the Seattle. We're everywhere. But as we sat there and took this provision, I remember sitting there and going, you know, I was laughing thinking about the Grand Canyon. When things weren't going my way, all I did was just fill up with panic, lose my mind, and got nowhere. But in this moment, I looked and said, you know what? I'm going to trust God to provide. I'm going to study this map of his word, right? And then as I move forward, I'm going to trust him to be the provision of water. And that's you in life. I want to encourage you as you walk out of here and walk into the unknown of life, that you would do that. I walk into this classroom. God, what am I doing here? I walk into this major. God, what's my purpose here? I walk into these relationships. How do I navigate this organization? I want you to stop and go, before I complain, let me trust that you're a sovereign God over this. Let me study your word to see what kind of person I'm meant to be in this environment. And then I trust Christ that you'll provide for me what I need to thrive in this space. And I promise you he will, and you'll glorify him for his faithfulness. I promise you.
Howdy, and welcome to the Breakaway Podcast. My name is Brent, and I'm here with Ben Stewart. If you're new to the podcast, this part is just a conversation with Ben and I, and hopefully it's helpful to you where we're going to kind of catch you up on some things that are coming, but also add a piece of content that maybe Ben cut from his notes or things he had to kind of rush past that it's going to give him a little bit more time to to talk about and expand upon. So, Ben, it was a great night. We had Jeff Johnson back with us.
Yeah, he did a great job. We had more students than the week before.
Yeah.
I think because tests were such a big thing last week, but we jumped up. It was crazy.
Yeah.
It was a lot of folks in there.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of sick folks, a lot of coughing. I don't know if that'll come through the mic, but these kids need to rest and take some vitamins or something. But such a sweet night to be together. And, it's funny, man, because you look and you go, with all this Exodus, given the time frame, we're covering like 3 chapters a night, which for me is anytime you're looking at your notes and going, let me cut out that passage of Holy Scripture. That is a horrible feeling. And so I have the hardest time cutting stuff out. But then I get to this moment and going, oh, man, so do I re-preach it all, or do I just go, look, let's just, so I'm not going to take you back through everything I cut out of my note. That would be nuts. I will add one thought to this, possibly two. And it's this, that it's interesting to say in Scripture, it's not just this anthology of everything that happened in the history of the world. It's not. The Bible's selective in what it tells you. How many kids did Adam and Eve have? We know they had at least 7. But we only get 3 of their names. Why? Because we're not... it's not that God doesn't care about the other sons and daughters they had. They're just not critical to the story the Bible's telling. The Bible is reporting history, but it's selecting which details. We all do that when we tell stories. You don't tell every detail about a room. You select stories that help advance the point you're trying to make about what happened. And so that's what we're seeing in Exodus. Is it's not fabricating, but it's selecting what to tell you. And what's interesting in this section is it selects 3 moments, 3 days into the journey, about a month and a half into the journey, and a little later. It selects these 3 moments where God puts a test in their life, and how do they respond? And it's doing it to prove a point. And I heard a pastor say it this way, and I thought it was so good. He said, God can get you out of slavery in an instant, but it takes a process to get the slavery out of you. And that's what you see happening. You see God set them free, boom, in an instant. Free, no longer slaves. Yet internally, they are still, when a crisis comes, they just panic, or they go, let's go back to the slavery in Egypt. Let's go back to the slavery, That's like someone getting off of a drug, and the process of detoxing is so painful, they go, let me just go back to the drug. You go, no, keep pressing through the pain because it's going to lead you to a better place. That's what God's doing with this wilderness, is he's putting them in situations where they have to rely on him. And that's so uncomfortable, they just want to go back to this lifestyle where they didn't rely on him at all. But that was death, that was oppression, that was bitterness. And God's like, no, push through the discomfort with me because I'm leading you to a better place. And that's what God's doing here. And I'll just say this was the only other thing I was going to mention. As I thought back on my college career, it's interesting, Brent. I don't remember a lot of Friday nights. And it's not that I was like hammered or something. I realize that sounds terrible. I don't remember too many Friday nights, Brent. No, I don't really remember, like my memories fade quick, anyone who knows me knows that, but I don't remember a lot of Friday nights. I don't remember a lot of the times we went dancing. I don't remember a lot of those, but I have some very clear memories from college, sitting in the parking garage where I used to work, reading about Oswald Chambers' life and seeing that God threw him all these curveballs that were like, what are you doing? And it ended up God used him mightily. And I remember sitting in that parking garage going, what am I doing? And realizing, Ben, you're right where I want you to be. I want you to trust me. I throw people some crazy curves they don't see coming, but it's for their good and for the good of the world. I remember spots in the library where I told him I'm in so much emotional pain over this relationship in my life, that one. I don't see any way out of it, but I trust you. I trust you. and then watching him provide. And the point I'm making is this: I have vivid memories of all the wilderness moments in college. And I remember them because they were the moments where I pressed into God because I had nowhere else to go, and I found that he was the best place to be. And so I look back now and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for those moments where he made me depend on him, because it's made me stronger in the right ways and softer in the right ways, humble in the right ways and confident in the right ways. It's made me the kind of person that I'm meant to be. And I have a long way to go, but I can see the wilderness has made me better. I can see that in college. And so I say that to all of you in college, that God will lead you to moments of total mystery. I don't know what he's doing. He will take away everything but him. And that's my prayer, is that you'll not do what the Israelites did. Just panic and doubt God and run to any addiction or distraction for comfort. That's not healthy. Run to complaining, run to lusts, run to anger. Kick all those props out of the way and run to him. And I promise you, he will meet you there, and he'll make the desert into a place of springs. He really will.
Yeah. Yeah, man. So I just love those sweet moments. And you talked about it a little bit in your talk, where God sends you a reminder of his faithfulness. Mm-hmm. And when we get those little glimpses of moments that we were led into crisis and God continued to be faithful, they're very helpful down the road. And so I would encourage everyone who's listening, think back to those moments where he was faithful. And that's good. Thanks, man.
And this is the Christian life.
Yeah.
We are saved in an instant by the grace of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then we are sanctified over years, right? He gets us out of slavery in an instant, but it takes a process to get the slavery out of us. Yeah. It's true. And thank God that he's willing to take us through that process.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, we love you guys. And we've got a couple breakaways in front of us. One of them coming up in a couple weeks is our Go Missions Conference, where we really emphasize taking the gospel of Jesus Christ to the nations. And we'll have some amazing breakout speakers coming to engage with our students, missions organizations from around the world coming to speak to our students, giving them a vision of a life bigger than themselves. And we got some special guests, Brent.
Yep.
Preaching for us, leading worship. I'm not going to say who it is. We're going to wait, but it's coming. So October 22nd and 23rd, we'll give you more details as the podcasts come ahead. But that's going to be a special week for us in Aggieland. And if you can get here, be here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thanks for listening. We hope it was helpful, and we'll see you next week.
See ya.